Okay, in this video we're going to talk more about objects and we're going to talk about binding. Okay, the idea of binding, you're binding the this keyword to a particular object. So last time we learned that in JavaScript, if you just attach one method from one object to another method or to another object, the this references in that method will refer to wherever it's attached. It doesn't matter where it's attached. It's not bound to the original object. Okay. Now, in some cases, you may want that behavior. You may want, for example, if I have Alice here and I have get full name, I may want this method, this keyword in here, to always be bound to Alice, right? So that's the concept of binding this. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a little helper function here to iterate over the properties in an object. Okay, so get a little bit of code here. So we're going to call this function print. We're just going to print out some hyphens. We are going to iterate over the properties in this. Okay, so this, what we're going to do is actually attach this function to different objects just to see what's going on. But this is going to be one object or another. Okay, and this syntax here for iterating over properties of an object, let property use the in keyword when you're iterating over the properties of an object. Okay, if you wanted to iterate over the items in an array, you would use the of syntax. Okay, so array items of array, properties in object. Okay, and the way I remember that is you use the of syntax when it's an ordered, when it's like arrays have ordered values. There's the item at index 0, index 1, index 2. So you use O, the O in of is ordered. Okay, so here we're trying to iterate over the properties of an object though. So we have a property name in this. The value then is this square bracket syntax to access the property. You pass in a variable that's holding a string. So this is really just passing in a string and you get a value back. Then we want to get the type of that thing, right? So we can use the type of keyword in JavaScript. So that's how you can find the types of things. All right. But then what do we want to do with that? We're going to basically just print this stuff out. Okay. So we need console.log here, and this might be advanced syntax to some of you, but it's very handy. You'll see it more and more. These are backticks. This is what's called a template string. Okay, if you're familiar with Python, it's kind of like a format string without the formatting. It just allows you to inject a JavaScript expression. In this case, they're very simple expressions. They're just the variable names. Those variable names get evaluated to their values, and those are injected whenever you have this $ curly brace syntax. Then once you're out of the curly brace syntax, we are back in string land. So that's a space character. This is a parenthesis that's actually in the string. Here we have the $ curly brace syntax again. So this is a JavaScript expression, one of the simplest kinds you can get. That's our type variable. It's evaluated to the value stored in type. That gets injected into the string. And then we're now back in string land. So there's a string character, string character, string character, and then this again. So this means that would be the JavaScript expression that gets evaluated and then injected here. All right, so that's all that is, but it's really handy to be able to construct strings that way. That way you don't have all of this. You don't have as much plus signs and quotation marks. It gets real messy when you try to concatenate too many things together. So this is a much nicer way of kind of looking at the string in code. All right, so that's all we're really doing here. We need to close our for loop and then close our function. All right, so here is our little print function. So what we can do is attach that to Alice. All right, so we say alice.print and just set that equal to our print function. And then we can call alice.print. All right, and let's go through here and run this. Node find this. Okay, so here we see, what are we printing out? We're printing out the property name, in parentheses the type, then a colon, and then the value. All right, so here's the property name, in parentheses it's a string, colon, the value is Alice. Property name is last. Type is string. Allison. Now this is where it gets interesting. Property name, the type is a function. Okay, so the type of keyword actually returns the string function because that's the type of this thing. And then in JavaScript, when you just print out a function, it actually prints out the text of that function. Okay, so get full name, it's actually printed out the code itself for as a string for this function. All right, and this is indeed what get full name is. Then we have the print method, and this is the code for that function, right? So this is close to what we want, except we want our particular getter methods, we probably want those to be evaluated, and we want to call those functions so we actually get the return value, right? So we have to kind of tweak our print function here. What we want to do is maybe keep, because we don't want to call the print function. We're going to stumble across the print function at some point, and we're already running the print function. So if when we encounter the print function, we call it again, then it's going to iterate through all the variables and get to print again, and then call that. And so you're going to get a recursive loop. And we're just going to keep calling print, keep calling print, keep calling print. So we don't want to do that. So we're going to have to keep track of a function not to call, right? And we could do a little something like this. Just post this code in here. And I'll explain it. Okay, so we keep track of a list of functions not to call. So the functions that we do want to call are like our getters. They just calculate values, all right? But some functions do other things, and we don't want to call those. In this case, the only one that actually does something that we don't want to call would be print. So if the type of our item here is a function, and then we can look to see this is an array, functions not to call. So if you want to find out if something is in an array, you use that array dot includes. So if this includes this property, right? So remember, property is the name of the property of the object. So this will be print, right? Because that's one of the properties. We're setting alice.print equal to this function. So print is the property name, and it's also the string that's inside of our functions not to call array. So if functions not to call dot includes print, right, then we're just going to say that this is a function for the value, all right? And we'll just print out function and not actually call it. But if it's not in our list or our array of functions not to call, then we're actually going to call the function. So this square bracket property, we're going to call that function, and that means this is going to get called. We'll get this calculation to occur. That value is going to be returned and stored in value, and then we're going to print this stuff out. Okay, so in the case that property is print, then value is going to just be function in all caps. So it'll say the type is function, and then the value will just be function in all caps. If it's any other function in our object, it's going to say type is lowercase function, and then the value is going to be calculated by executing that function. All right, so we made this little tweak here and see how that works. Okay, so this is a little cleaner now. First name Alice, last name Allison, get full name Alice Allison. So we actually executed that function and got the result. And then here, when we have a function we didn't actually want to call when we're printing stuff out, we just label it as function. So this type of thing is really important that you really understand. You'll see this sort of thing a lot. And for like debugging, knowing how to do this and how this works is really, really important. Making your own print function that can do this for you is a very important skill, right? And you have to know a fair amount about how things work. You have to understand this. You have to understand how to iterate over properties on an object. You have to know about types. You have to know about, functions are first-class citizens in JavaScript. You can pass them around like any other variable, accessing items in an array, right? That sort of thing. Okay, so this is very important for you to be able to do on your own. All right, so now let's move to another example. Let's put this Bob object in here. Okay, so we have Alice and we have a Bob object, and Bob is Bob and Roberts. And then here, this is an additional way of adding a property to an object. So this is advanced JavaScript. Instead of doing the key name colon and then the name of something that you want to set the value of, well, this is just an identifier. This is a variable. So what's really happening is this variable is JavaScript is finding and locating that variable, and the value of that variable is found, and that's what's associated with this property. Now these just happen to have the same exact name. When they have the same exact name, JavaScript allows you to do this. So you don't have to have the extra duplication, right? So if I just have a key in an object with no value, that means the key to Bob, this should be bob.print, the value is whatever print is stored at in this context, right? So print is this function. Okay, so this is advanced JavaScript. It comes up a lot in code if you see this. So, remember, objects are always key value pairs, but then you have something like this. It might make you think that it's an array. It's not an array. It's a special syntax, and you can only do it when the current identifier in the scope is the same as the key name. Okay, so the key name we're using here is print, and the identifier name in the current scope is also print. So we can just say this. All right, bob.getFullName, we're going to set that equal to alice.getFullName. All right, and then what we want to do is have Bob have a full name getter for himself. All right, that's what we want this to be. But then we also want Bob to have a function, a method on him that is going to access Alice's full name. Right, so get Alice full name. And what we want this one to do is when we call this one, it's going to calculate Alice's full name, not our full name, right? So right now, they're both going to be bound to Bob, but eventually we want the second one to be bound to Alice. Okay, so we run this. Okay, Bob Roberts function, get full name, Bob Roberts. So remember, this was defined on Alice. Now it's attached to Bob, and the this in that function now refers to Bob. But what we want for the second one, this is going to be get Alice's full name. What we want is that function to actually be bound to Alice. So when we run it, this says Alice, even though it's coming from the Bob object. Okay, so how can we do that? All right, there's a few different ways of doing something like this. Okay, so we can join or bind a method to a specific object using a wrapper function. Okay, so one way to do this would be to take our Bob object. We are going to assign a value to the keyword get Alice full name wrapper. All right, and we have a function. We're setting this equal to a function, and what we're returning is we're going to go ahead and just reference Alice because we've already defined Alice up here. Our function should have access to this Alice keyword because variable name, because Alice was defined outside of the function scope. So functions have access to things that are defined before them, right? So this function scope has access to Alice, so I can just reference Alice, the object, directly, call get full name, and execute that function, and it's attached to Alice, so it's going to reference Alice. This keywords will reference Alice, and we'll get Alice's full name, right? And so now we can just print Bob again, and this one should print Alice's name. Okay, so Alice, Allison. So the way we did this is we made a wrapper function. You'll see wrapper functions used all the time in JavaScript. It's a quick little function that allows you to grab a different context or something like that, right? So you wrap a function around something else. Okay, so get Alice full name wrapper. What else can we do? We can use, there's a built-in bind method. So the built-in bind function in JavaScript, we can bind the this to a specific object. So in this case, we're going to create a function called get Alice full name, but we're using the bind method here. Last time we used the name wrapper method. Now we're binding with the actual bind method. Okay, so to do this, all functions in JavaScript have a built-in bind method. And you can ask yourself, well, how does a function have a method? It brings up what I was talking about before. Literally everything in JavaScript is an object. Okay, so even functions are objects. When we printed out the function, there's actually a toString method on functions that prints out the string context of the code, right? So everything in JavaScript is an object, and so even functions, they have methods on them. So you can bind this function, and what that does is it sets the this context to a particular object. So if I have alice.getFullName, that's the function, I can bind that to the Alice object. All right, and so get Alice full name bind should now be bound to Alice. So when I run this, this in this particular function that we declared on Alice up here, right? This, we have now bound this keyword to the object Alice. And we could have bound it to anything. We didn't have to bind it to Alice. We could bind it to any object we wanted. All right, and so now we can Bob print here. All right, so now we see the original get full name for Bob. We tried to get Alice's full name, but that didn't work because it was unbound. So we tried the bound method, the binding method of a name wrapper, and then that worked, the wrapper function. And then here we actually used the bind method. Okay, can we build our own approximation of the bind function? Yes, but it's probably not ideal. So what we can do is we can take a look. We have a wrapper function. We want to attach a function to an object via temporary property, call the method from the object, then remove the temporary method. Okay, so something like this you might see in JavaScript, and this is definitely what they would call hacky. Okay, so this is not probably something that you would want to do in a professional environment, but something like this is important to know that you can do so you can investigate code, and it gives you a much better understanding about how JavaScript works as well. So this is probably not something that you want to do in practice, but for debugging or something like that, it might be interesting, and for your own sort of education about this stuff. All right, so here's our function. We have myBind, we have an object that we want to bind the this keyword to, and we have that particular function. Okay, now this can be any function. It's not attached to a particular object. It's just, again, in JavaScript, they say that functions are first-class citizens, meaning that they can be passed around just like any other data type, right? So strings and integers, you can pass them to other functions. So this function is taking a function in. We're going to make a special property name and attach it to our object. Okay, and then once it's attached to our object, then the this should reference this object. Okay, so we have to pick something that's sort of ridiculous because we don't want to overwrite another property name on our object. Okay, so this is why I've chosen something ridiculous like this. This is also why this solution, you would call this hacky, right? Because what if they actually had the string on there? We would be overwriting their data, and we don't want to do this. So this is pretty hacky, but it's interesting. It shows how things work. All right, so we have this property, and we're going to attach, it's a property name, we're going to attach that, this function to this object, and we're going to call it this property name. All right, and so we're going to return a function, right? So the whole point of binding, if we look up here, this bind, what this did, this returned a function which was stored here. Okay, so the whole point of .bind is to return a function. Now that function, when executed, should be bound to this Alice object. Right, so that's the point of what we're trying to do down here. We have the object here, and we have our function. Okay, so the function that gets returned, so this is some advanced JavaScript. This is a way to collect all the arguments in a function. Okay, so you use this spread syntax, ... That means any arguments, and again, this is a function definition here, right? We're defining an anonymous function here. You see this syntax a lot. Whenever you see the function keyword, this is just defining a function, and then we're returning that function that we just defined. So we could store this as a variable and then return that variable, but there's not much point in that. So you see this all the time in JavaScript. So this is a function definition. This is the spread operator. what this is doing is it's going to collect all of the arguments that are supplied and put them in an array. Okay, so when you see this syntax inside of where the parameters are defined of a function, that collects all of the arguments into an array. Then what we're going to do is we have a reference to our object here, because this function definition is the object variable is outside the scope of the function. So this function has access to this. And so we can just say object, and we're going to add this property to our object and set that equal to our function, right? Then what we want to do is we want a value. And so we are going to call this newly attached function right here. We just attached it to our object, and it's still attached to our object. So now we're going to call the function, but we're going to take that argument list, or that argument array, and when you use the spread operator inside of a function call, it does the opposite. So in a function definition, it collects all the arguments into a list, or an array rather, and in a function call, it expands an array into individual arguments. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and call this, but it's been attached to this object now. So in this way, this is always going to reference the object because we attached it to the object. All right, and then we get a value back. Now we have to clean up after ourselves. So we're going to delete the item on this object with this property name, right? So that cleans up. We had to attach it with a property name, right? So that cleans this up. And then this function just returns the resulting value. Whatever function returned, right? It's going to return that. But function, we temporarily bound it to the object. Okay? So again, this is something that's really hacky. You wouldn't want to do this in like professionally, but this demonstrates how binding works in JavaScript, and it's really good to be able to understand this and maybe recreate this yourself. And there's a lot going on here, right? We're passing in functions as first-class citizens. We're using the spread operator in two different ways, right? We're deleting object properties, right? So this is pretty abstract, but it's important to understand. All right. And then there's another way we can bind objects. We can use .call. So .call is generally a much better solution. It allows you to specify the object that this should be referencing to when the function is called. Okay, so this is an alternative. So we had myBind up here. Here is myBind2. And then we're going to add this. So the idea with myBind2 is we have an object, and instead of making this kind of hacky thing where we attach the property to the object, right? All functions actually have a built-in .call method, and that allows you to call the function, but you specify the object that you want this to reference as the first argument to call, and then the rest of the arguments to call are the arguments that you want to pass into that function. Okay, so this is a much better way of doing what we did up here, right? But it's good to be able to conceptually understand what's happening here, right? And so this might actually be something you would see in a professional code base. Not likely anymore. This is more of an older way of doing things, right? But let's run this. So here we have our two Bob Roberts, and then all of these we see in our new bind. That's myBind and myBind2. Both of those do indeed, even though these functions are attached to Bob, it does indeed bind to Alice. So there are additional ways to bind as well, but they relate to constructor functions. So we're going to get into constructor functions next time, and then we'll start getting into the class syntax. And technically there's no need for the class syntax in JavaScript. It's basically syntactic sugar to make people who come from classical types of languages more comfortable in JavaScript. Okay, so we're going to start getting into that next. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.